Welcome back. About a month ago, I did a 70-mile-an-hour highway range test with a 2023 Cadillac Lyriq rear-wheel drive. The vehicle went 330 miles at a constant 70 miles an hour from 100% charged down to 0. Now, a lot of my followers commented that they wished I had done it at a higher speed. Now, I do all of my range tests at 70 miles an hour so I can compare vehicle to vehicle. But it seemed like an unusual amount of people requested me to do the Lyriq at a higher speed because they live in areas of the country, I suppose, where you can drive much faster than that. Here in New Jersey, it's really difficult to maintain 80 miles an hour for a long period of time on any given road. You can do it in short bursts, but then you run into some sort of traffic here and there. So you really can't maintain 80 miles an hour. For me to do this with my range test, I have to basically have conditions where I can set the cruise control to the speed I want to do it at and not have to slow down at all, which is what I do with the 70-mile-an-hour range tests. So in order to do this, I had to do it late at night, after midnight, when I know the roads are mostly empty here, which is exactly what I did. I got the same Lyriq. I rented it from a person that rents it online. About a month later, it only had about 500 more miles on it than when I rented it the first time. I picked a day where the temperature was about the same as when I did the first range test, and I repeated this test on the same course at 80 miles an hour. And in this video here today, we're going to look at the comparison and see just how much further the Cadillac Lyriq will go at 70 miles an hour than it will if you bump your speed up to 80 miles an hour and drive the battery down to 0. All right, well, we're out on the highway. I got the Super Cruise on, the hands-free Super Cruise, which works really well. Cruising along at 80 miles an hour. I hope I can maintain the 80 miles an hour. It's not always easy to do here in New Jersey. You can always do it in spurts, but for me to be able to do 80 miles an hour for maybe 4 hours straight without slowing down might be a little challenging, but it's late at night. It's after midnight, so if there's ever going to be a time I could do it, it's now. So we'll talk a little bit about what I do on all the range tests to try to make it as fair as possible. First thing I do is make sure the tire pressure is set to the specified tire pressure you get in the door jamb. With the Lyriq, that's 42 PSI. All the tires have been set at 42 PSI. I always put the vehicle in the most efficient driving mode. With the Lyriq, that's the Tour driving mode. So we're in Tour driving mode. I check my wind apps. Right now we have about a 3-mile-an-hour wind that's coming in from the northwest, so it's not bad. 3 miles an hour, it's really good. Very similar to the wind that I experienced when I did the 70-mile-an-hour Lyriq drive, which ended up, as I said earlier, with 330 miles of range. As far as climate control, I always run the climate control somewhere between 68 degrees and 70 degrees and at the lowest fan setting. So I have the Lyriq here set at 70 degrees on fan setting 1. When I started the range test, it was about 80 degrees outside, the ambient temperature down to 78 already. So it's going to get a little bit cooler over the night, but it's still great range weather in the 70s and 80 miles and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It was 90 degrees today during the day, so I'm sure the Lyriq's battery is nice and warm from sitting outside all day and then DC fast charging. So we've got her all set up and good to go. I checked the Lyriq's speedometer with GPS, and 80 miles an hour was a true 80 miles an hour. The Lyriq speedometer was perfect at 70, and again, it's perfect at 80. So GM has it really dialed in perfectly as far as the speedometer calibration. Okay, so we're gonna check back in when I'm at 75% state of charge, and we're a quarter of the way through. We'll see you then. This video, as well as all of the videos here on State of Charge, is sponsored by Qmerit. Once I've helped you decide which electric vehicle charger you're going to buy, then follow the link in the description of my videos and have Qmerit install it. All right, checking in at 75% state of charge. We're a quarter of the way through, and in that segment there, the Lyriq went 61 miles. Now, in my 70 mile an hour highway range test, we ended up with 330 miles. So if you divide that up into quarters, it would have gone 82.5 miles. So we've gone significantly less, which I expected, because the range with all electric vehicles, not just the Lyriq, the faster you go, it really cuts into your range. You know, it's almost exponential range loss with every mile an hour faster that you go over, like 65 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour. So at 80, I knew it was going to take a big hit. Our consumption rate here is 2.3 miles per kilowatt hour now. I finished up the 70 mile an hour highway range test with 3.1 mile per kilowatt hour. And since the Lyriq has a battery pack a little bit more than 100 kilowatt hour, you can do the math. That's a significant difference in miles that we're probably going to be able to go here today. Now, as far as battery pack size, General Motors states that the usable capacity for the Lyriq is 102 kilowatt hours. However, in my 70 mile an hour range test, I drew down, I think it was 104.3 kilowatt hours out of the battery pack. So that number, that 102 that GM publishes, it's not a hard number. You can pull out different amounts of capacity depending on how that electricity is drawn. Like if you drive your EV really hard and you stomp on it and you're really pushing it, you'll get less out of the pack than if you were to just drive at 50 miles an hour constantly. That doesn't stress the battery, so you actually end up getting more usable capacity. So GM's number of 102 isn't set in stone. It really depends on how you drive it. I expect to get at least that on this range test. Probably not as much as I got at 70 miles an hour, because driving at 80 miles an hour, I'm stressing the pack a little bit more, but we'll see at the end of the range test. But for now, in that first quarter, we used 26.3 kilowatt hour. So we'll see what happens when we finish up. We'll check back in at 50% and see how far we've gotten. All right, we're at 50% state of charge. We're halfway home on the Cadillac Lyriq 80 mile an hour highway range test. And we've gone 120 miles. So we didn't go quite as far in that second quarter as we did in the first quarter. Our consumption is up also. We're now averaging 2.2 miles per kilowatt hour as opposed to the 2.3 that we averaged in the first quarter. So we're using a little bit more energy. The wind is about the same. We're at about 4 mile an hour wind now. So the wind isn't too much of a issue here. It's actually pretty good to only be 4 miles an hour ahead. When the wind is less than 7 or 8 miles an hour, it doesn't seem to have too much of an effect on the range test, although at these higher speeds it's going to have a little bit more of an effect. But 4 miles an hour really isn't bad. So far we've used 52.9 kilowatt hour, so we're tracking similar amount of total energy for this trip as when I did the first range test, where I used about 104 kilowatt hour total on the range test. So we're pretty much tracking the same, which is what you would expect. This Lyriq only has a few hundred miles on it more than when I did the first range test. Okay, so we'll check back in. That'll be the last check-in before the range test is over at 25% state of charge. We're gonna go considerably less distance than we did with the 70 mile an hour highway range test. Now we're at 120 miles at 50%, and on the first range test we went 330 miles. So half of that would be 165 miles. So 165 miles, 120 miles, that's 45 more miles just by slowing it down and going 10 miles an hour slower. That's how much of an effect that speed has on your EVs. I remember when I was first getting into EVs and learning, just cutting my teeth on it. And I remember one of the guys that was an experienced electric vehicle driver at the time. He had a home-built EV he made in the 70s, and he knew everything about EVs. I learned a lot from him. He told me the one thing about electric vehicles, you can go fast or you can go far, but you can't go both. And we're learning that with the range test here. Significant amount of range loss when you jump it up from 70 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour. Okay, we'll check back in at 25% and see where we're at. Checking back in at 25% state of charge. This is our last check-in before the range test is complete. So we are at 178 miles driven. Our consumption rate is holding steady at 2.2 miles per kilowatt hour, and we have consumed 78.5 kilowatt hour. So we're tracking to use pretty much the same amount of kilowatt hour that I used on the 70 mile an hour highway range test. No surprise there. But one thing I want to note, if you did watch my 70 mile an hour highway range test, I complained a lot about the fact that GM EVs don't give you a numeric state of charge. And my stance hasn't changed on that. I think it's an absolute terrible policy. One of the only companies where you can't get a numeric state of charge on your driver's display. Make it configurable. If the consumer doesn't want it, they can flip it off, but give us a numeric state of charge. Whomever at GM has decided that, through the HMI, that people don't want to see a numeric state of charge, they're just bonkers and they don't own or drive EVs. In any event, end of rant. I always have to have at least one rant on state of charge when I do a GM range test. So in any event, but what I did learn after I made the last video, some of my followers said, hey Tom, you can get the numeric state of charge. You just ask the Google Assistant, which I've been doing. So I've been checking in right at the right checkpoints, 25%, 50%, 75%. In the 70 mile an hour higher range test, I had to kind of guess where I was because I just had the bar that was slowly disintegrating as your state of charge lowered. But now I'm using the Google Assistant, which is fine. I'm still not satisfied with that. I want to have a numeric state of charge displayed on the driver's screen. And as I said, if customers don't want it, they can configure it. They give you 3 different options on the driver's screen. Just have it on one of those screens so somebody can toggle and just check it if they want to see that. The more information is the better. I still want remaining miles, the remaining miles that they're estimating, which there's another issue I have with GM. Once you get down like under 15 remaining miles, it just says low, which is, again, ridiculous, GM, and they will change this. Mark my words. General Motors will add a numeric state of charge, and they will change that low and show the remaining range all the way to 0 at some point. I don't know when it's going to happen, but they're going to change that because it's very poor, HMI the way it is right now. And I understand all the OEMs are trying to figure out what exactly do EV owners want to see. They know what their combustion owners want to see because they've been doing it and refining it for years and decades. But a lot of the OEMs are still trying to figure out what does the EV driver want. I was actually hired, I guess it was 9 years ago, by one of the existing OEMs to do consulting on HMI. And they basically said that question, look, we know what our combustion owners want to see, but we really don't know what EV drivers want to see on their display. So I understand they're fumbling a little bit with that, but they'll get around to it. Mark my words, GM's going to show a numeric state of charge at some point down the future for the driver to see. So anyway, again, end of rant. We're driving now down from 25% to 0. We'll check in when we're done. But as you can see, significantly less range when you jump up from 70 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour. The driving conditions are nearly identical. It's a little bit cooler because I'm doing it at night now. Right now it's down to 73 degrees. And when we started, it was around 80. When I did the 70 mile an hour high range test, I think we started at around 70 and it went up to about 80, but it was in direct sunlight and the sun was kind of baking in the cabin. But the climate control is using the same amount as it did when I did the 70 mile an hour high range test. It's only using 1%, and 99% is for driving and accessories, which I do love that GM shows this, the breakdown of where your energy went. I think it's a great option to have, and I'm glad that GM does that. They're getting there, and a lot of the things I like what you get with GM. But but they can improve some of their charging displays, what you see with charging, and then also with regards to the state of charge. All right, we'll check back in when we're just about done, and we'll see where we're at. All right, so I'm in the parking lot of the Electrify America charging station. We are done. I actually pulled off the highway about 4 miles ago, but I wasn't at 0, so I drove on some back roads at about 50 miles an hour. So the last 5 miles was at 50 miles an hour, not 80 miles an hour. And in that 5 miles, our consumption efficiency went from 2.2, which it was the whole time, to 2.3. So we are finishing up. The vehicle showing 2.3 miles per kilowatt hour, but it was at 2.2 virtually the 3/4 of the last trip. I think that last 4 miles driving a little bit slower just was able to push up. So it must have been on the cusp the whole time. Okay, let me pull into this charging station here. Of course, nobody's here because it is 3:30 in the morning, or it's actually 3:15 about. All right, park. All right, I've been in reduced power mode the last, I don't know, 15 miles or so. Okay, and now we have gone 245 miles. We've used 104.7 kilowatt hour, which is exactly the amount of battery that I used on my 70 mile an hour highway range test. So this is a perfect comparison. Similar conditions as far as temperature and wind, only about a month apart, the same vehicle on the same tires. We're averaged 2.3 miles per kilowatt hour. We averaged 3.1 miles per kilowatt hour at 70 miles an hour. 2.3 now at 80 miles an hour. We went 245 miles. We went 330 miles at 70 miles an hour. So that's 85 miles less using the same amount of battery. And that just goes to show you how significant it is to, if you don't need to drive fast, just take it down a few miles an hour. You can go so much further in your electric vehicle. It's not just the Lyriq. This is really with all electric vehicles. Now, they're all going to react slightly differently. There's some vehicles that do better at higher speeds. The Porsche Taycan, for instance, it just really does really well at high speeds. It's very aerodynamic. It's geared for high-speed driving. But the almost every electric vehicle you drive, if you could just keep it to like 70 miles an hour, it'll make a huge difference. Once you jump up to 75, 80, you could see just how much of a range hit you're going to take. Now, of course, this is just for the Lyriq, but you're going to see similar reduction like that with other electric vehicles. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump over to probably tomorrow. You're going to see in the next scene. I'm going to be home. I'm going to digest all this. I'm going to put the numbers up on a chart so we could see exactly how much difference it was going from 70 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour, driving the vehicle from 100% down to 0. Okay, so 245 miles at a constant 80 miles an hour, 330 miles at a constant 70 miles an hour. That's 85 miles less, or about 26% less. That's more than I expected, quite honestly. I've been driving EVs for 14 years now, and I know that the faster you go, the less distance you can travel. And I know that the speed really deteriorates like exponentially once you get over 60 miles an hour. I try to tell my followers, if you really are concerned about making your destination, always slow down a bit. Right around 60 miles an hour, you can get so much more range than if you were to go 75 or 80 miles an hour. You see here, just that 10 mile an hour jump from 70 to 80 miles an hour knocked 85 miles off the Lyriq's range. Now, if I had gone 60 miles an hour and done that test, I'm sure we would have went much further than the 330. It would have been more than 100 miles of range difference between going to 60 miles an hour versus 80 miles an hour. But I know 60 miles an hour is a little bit too slow to expect anybody to drive that on the highway, at least for long periods of time. In any event, so now let's take a look at some of these stats. I put together a little graphic here to compare the two range tests, and we're going to take a look at that right now. Okay, so as I said earlier, this was the Cadillac Lyriq rear-wheel drive range test comparison from 100% down to 0. At 70 miles an hour, I drove 330 miles. At 80 miles an hour, 245 miles. As I said, that's about 26% less. The consumption rate was 3.1 miles per kilowatt hour at 70 miles an hour and 2.3 miles per kilowatt hour at 80 miles an hour. Now, I also did a little math here to figure out how much it would cost me to drive 1,000 miles based on if I charged the Lyriq at home or if I was, say, on a road trip and I was using Electrify America charging stations. So based on my home electricity rate of 15 cents per kilowatt hour, to drive 1,000 miles at a constant 70 miles an hour, it would cost me $47.59. At 80 miles an hour, that jumps up to $64.10. So you can see where driving faster is going to add up over time. Now, let's say you're on a long road trip and you were using Electrify America. Now, the one thing I have to mention here is that Electrify America has just transitioned to dynamic pricing, which means it's different pricing all over the country. I used what I would pay here in New Jersey, which is 36 cents per kilowatt hour with my Price Plus plan. If you have a Price Plus plan with Electrify America, you pay $7 a month and you get a 25% savings over the standard rate of 48 cents per kilowatt hour. But I have the Price Plus plan, so I pay 36 cents per kilowatt hour. It would cost me $114.22 to drive 1,000 miles at 70 miles an hour. But if I was on a road trip and I wanted to go get there a little bit quicker and I bumped it up to 80 miles an hour, it would cost me $153.85 for every 1,000 miles driven. As I said before, you could see it's gonna add up. So not only do you not go as far driving faster, you're gonna pay a lot more to cover the same ground. All right, well, that's a wrap on the Cadillac Lyriq highway range test comparison, 70 miles an hour versus 80 miles an hour. As you can see, there's a big difference if you just go 10 miles an hour faster. You're not gonna go as far and it's gonna cost you a lot more to cover the same ground. Now, not all EVs are created equal. Some are more efficient at higher speeds. Say, for instance, a Porsche Taycan. I'm sure that the Taycan wouldn't have a 26% difference jumping from 70 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour. It'd probably be somewhere around 15% because it's a lot more aerodynamic and it's geared for high-speed highway driving more so than the Lyriq would be. But it would definitely not go as far if you jumped up from 70 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour. And as I said in the video, I've always used that one phrase, you can go fast or you can go far, but you can't do both in an electric vehicle. Listen, if this is your first time here, please don't forget, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss any upcoming electric vehicle news and reviews. And as always, thanks for watching.